Well, hello, everyone. Welcome back to another edition of History and Whatever with me, your host, James Manning III. And today, we are going to talk about George Carlin's final book, Last Words. You know, this is one that I found really helpful as a comedian because you get to see a side of George Carlin that nobody really gets to see. You really have to dig into it to find out what his life was like. And, he was one of the most loved and respected comedians of all time. And, when I was reading the book, I tried to think about what is it that I'm trying to get from this? And that kind of changed as I read the book and went through and tried to find interesting parts of it. And what did I want to talk about? Did I want to talk about his whole life and just make it the history of George Carlin? No, of course not. That's not what I'm into. My main goal when I do these books is to encourage others to go and read them, because we don't do enough reading in our society, at least in my opinion. And the more we read, the more knowledge we have, the better we're going to be. And you get an insight on someone who you normally only see as fully developed and in his heyday, putting out massive specials on HBO or doing Carnegie Hall. But what you don't see is how he got there. So that's what we're going to talk about today on History and Whatever. Stick around. George Carlin was the 23rd inductee into the official National Comedy Hall of Fame. George Dennis Patrick Carlin, born May 12, 1937, passed away June 22nd, 2008. So, what am I talking about today? That's a good question. As I went through this book, I found things that I found that are helpful to a comedian to see what somebody who turned out to be one of the biggest comedy icons came up right next to Richard Pryor. They were running in the same circles. And, I came across a lot of things that I wasn't aware of. And it took me a little while to kind of digest what I was seeing and how do I put this into some sort of cohesive narrative that isn't necessarily a history, but more of a look of what George Carlin has done for us, for not just free speech in America, but specifically for comedians. And I discovered a few things about old Carlin that I had no clue, which was really fun. And a few things that aren't so fun. Also, in a strange way, the things that he's encountered over his life we're still battling today in 2024. And Carlin was one of those people who helped bring them to the fore. And right in the beginning of his book, he starts talking about how there's this legend. His mother was going to have an abortion, and at one point, there was like this picture on the wall. And in that picture, his mother envisioned her mother, who had passed away not long ago, and she couldn't go forward with the abortion. It says right here, "Then it happened. My mother had a vision. Sometimes when you're trying to be born, that religious shit can really come in handy." And she turned around and looked at his father and said, "Pat, I'm going to have this baby." That's how George Carlin's life really began, as he was about to be aborted, but she decided at the last minute to jump up and get out of there. And then we have little Carlin. And of course, he was in school. He was a It appears that he was sort of the disruptive type, but it's cool to read through and see his reflections on his young life as a Irish Catholic kid growing up in New York and going to Catholic schools and things like that. You have to remember he was born in 1937, so George Carlin was born in a time that was completely removed from our own. Something that modern folks really just don't have any idea about and how it was back then. And one of the things that I discovered that he was actually in the Air Force and got into plenty of trouble during that time, but he grew up right in the middle of World War II. 1937, he just kind of missed World War II. So he was 17 when he joined the Air Force in 1954. He had just missed Korea. His mother had to sign him in because he was 17. And I got a quote here. But mainly, I joined the Air Force with a clear goal, using the GI Bill to train myself as a disc jockey at disc jockey school. Funny how a teenager thinks. I had it all mapped out. I'll become a disc jockey someplace, and I'll be so good in that town I'll get famous enough to appear in a nightclub. I'll become a comedian there, get funny enough to be a comedian on Broadway. After that, I'll be in the movies. Piece of cake. So when he joined the Air Force, he already knew what he wanted to do. He wanted to get on the radio. He wanted to be a comedian. That's what he wanted to do. Strange. I never knew he was in the Air Force at all, but he had kind of an interesting run of it. It says here, I gravitated towards the black airmen, some of whom were from around my neighborhood in Harlem. Others came from the south side of Chicago or the Harrow neighborhood in Cleveland. I had more in common with them, jazz, R&B, stuff I could talk about. The white kids were mostly farm kids from upstate New York, Ohio, and points west. No bonding with them. He said, I'm quoting here, skipping ahead a little bit. The flight commander had his own room to live in at the end of the hall. Ours was a big black guy called Don with powerful shoulders who had been a swimmer in high school in Chicago. He was half full of shit, but he did get to choose the squad leaders, the front rank marchers, who led each column and had a little bit of clout. Don chose 2 black guys and me because I was a cool guy. I just like the way he puts that. He used to have to go to these training courses, I guess, in the Air Force, and his flight commander, Don, would get him out of a lot of those. And he said, Don would get me off a lot of classes. I had been selected for a more important mission. In the morning, he had handed me a list. My orders for the day. Go down to BX, the base exchange, and steal these records. Don was a shrewd tactician. Being a big city kid, I was good at stealing. Being white, I was less likely to be scrutinized while browsing the racks. My skill put me in his good graces. He let me hang in his room after the other guys had lights out and listen to the records I'd stolen. One day at the BX, on a search and acquire mission, I spotted this one striper I could swear I'd met somewhere. Then it hit me. He was from my neighborhood, and I'd scored pot from him once. He was a rank above me, almost a god. Anyone with a stripe could order you to do things and you had to obey. Here was a real dilemma. Does the Uniform Code of Military Justice allow me to approach him or not? Does it allow me to score pot from him or not? I needn't have agonized. Apparently, he allowed me to do both. So he's on the barracks, stealing records, scoring weed, and smoking it with his flight commander. Okay. So after that, he was transferred, and he ended up going to Louisiana. And I'm quoting from the book here. He calls it Barksdale Air Force, across the Red River from Shreveport, Louisiana, which, according to my friend Jose, was the fucking armpit of the fucking nation. Okay. And then, this is something that reminds us of how far removed we are from the time that Carlin came up. And I quote here, every base has an NCO club, which is non-commissioned officers, and an officers club. But this was the 50s deep south and segregated. He kind of just talks about how he went and hung out with the black airmen because that's who he connected with the most. You know, he was kind of ostracized from a lot of the mainstream white culture on the barracks because he liked to hang out with them. It's just kind of, it's even weird for my brain to think about how they had separate officers clubs. And there's even a story in here about how one night he spent a night in jail just because there was a black guy driving and he was in the back and they got pulled over. So he's talking about being in jail. Says, I had 3 joints in my sock and they hadn't searched us. So we smoked pot all night in 1955, blacks and whites together, in the Bossier City jail. Blew the fucking smoke out the fucking window. That felt good. Isn't that something? He got into a lot of trouble, it turns out. There's a few ways that I could go over this, but one of the the best quotes that I could find that would kind of sum it up is this here. My Air Force record on stripes was this. I got 1 stripe, I lost 1 stripe. I got 1 stripe, I got 2 stripes, lost 1 stripe. Got 2 stripes, lost 1 stripe, lost another stripe. I earned 6 stripes and lost 4 stripes. By the time I got out, I felt like a fucking zebra. So there's some stories about, you know, coming in late and reporting back to the base. And, you know, this is where he actually did get on the radio for the first time on KJOE. And he got a little bit of radio work. You know, he started his career while he was still in the Air Force. Of course, that was his goal the whole time. And at one point, he's stationed in England, and he listens to the Armed Forces radio for the World Series, Dodgers and the Yankees, right? And it says here, I stagger back to the base, and it's the middle of the fucking night, and I'm still celebrating. The barracks chief, the tag sergeant, starts raining on my parade, yelling, "Shut up, Carlin. Go fuck yourself, cocksucker." Gross insubordination. Grounds for my second court-martial. So that's 2 court-martials and 4 more Article 15s after the first one. In my Air Force career to date, a grand total of 7 major disciplinary offenses. Pretty fucking impressive. You know, this book is so great because this is really Carlin. And from what I understand, he worked with a guy to finish it. Like, he kind of told him what he wanted in the book, and guy ended up finishing it after he passed away. But this is pretty much what Carlin wanted the book to say, and they worked on most of it. So this is his voice coming through, talking about his experience in the Air Force, which he eventually was released, I suppose, and he still got to retain all of his, like, you know, GI rights and that kind of thing. They called it a 3916. It says right here, they decided I was something called a 3916, which was like a no-fault divorce. They kind of just knew that it wasn't working for him. So I'm kind of just skipping around. There's another story in there about how he used to go and get hot dogs that were microwaved in a... Microwaves were new at the time, and he wasn't sure how much radiation he was getting on these microwaved hot dogs. So, and the reason I'm telling you guys this is because this is something about George Carlin that I never knew, period. I didn't know anything about it, and it kind of helps to shape the character of who the guy was. He gets out of the Air Force, and he hooks up with this guy, Burns, and they form a group called Burns and Carlin. And these two, they're a comedy duo, and this is kind of how he gets his start in comedy. Reading about how he got into comedy and how he started performing with Jack Burns. I'll just read a quote here. 2 things happen now. First, Murray knows a guy at Era Records, Herb Newman, and he gets Herb Newman to record us. $300 advance. but we're only in LA for a month and we've already recorded an album. Second, an important part of our act was an imitation of Mort Shaw and one of Lenny Bruce. I did them both because I was better mimic than Jack, and to imitate them in the 60s was something of an act of defiance. So we felt far out. That was the term of the time. These guys are really far out. They do Lenny and Morton Shaw. You know, he's just getting started and he's already got a record in 1960. This is something that I find as a comedian to be really interesting because they kind of just get jettisoned into career of comedy right off the bat after spending a little bit of time in radio. He says here, it was June 1960. We'd been in the business for 5 months. We had an album, a manager, and a big agency, and Lenny Bruce liked us. So, you know, and then he's at the Playboy Club, just, doing his thing, Burns and Carlin, and he's just moving right along. You know, he's getting real recognition and coming up in the world of comedy in the 60s, which was a completely different time. Like, what comedy was in the 60s was not even close to what we hear today because of the standards that they had in polite society at the time. But even though they had a record out and they were doing pretty good, they still were, still struggling financially. He was with his wife, Brenda, and she ended up becoming pregnant, and they were homeless. They were like, here, I'll read a quote here. As Brenda's mother was dying, our child was born, a daughter. We named her Kelly. Now we were 3, and broke, and homeless. We moved back to 121st Street, and I borrowed money from anyone I could. Old friends from the neighborhood, Mort Shaw, my mother, anyone. He had his career going and they were getting work. It was just he still was broke. He goes through and starts talking about some of these clubs that he was able to get into. The A-Go-Go. He was a regular on Mort Shaw. And he says something else. He got a little deal in the Go-Go Club. He offered the same deal to a number of young musicians, but only to one other comic, a guy 3 years my junior named Richard Pryor. So him and Pryor are running through the same circles. Still, they're just coming up. People are just starting to know who Richard Pryor and George fucking Carlin are. This is the kind of stuff that I didn't consider when I was listening to the albums. I didn't think about any of this. And he starts talking about a little bit more about Lenny Bruce and how that affected him and the things that he saw when he was there in the mix of the scene. And Lenny Bruce was one of the biggest comedians around. I'm quoting from the book here. 2 years earlier, in 1961, Lenny Bruce had become to be a hit with a series of arrests for obscenities in San Francisco, Los Angeles at 3 different clubs, Chicago, and finally New York twice in 2 weeks at the Cafe A-Go-Go. The British police also deported him from the UK when he tried to perform in London. I guess it would be clinically paranoid to think that these were coordinated, but because several ended in acquittal or mistrial, in one case he was illegally tried in absentia, and because he was often arrested while awaiting trial for previous arrests, it certainly looked like there was some degree of consensus. As if by some kind of Bush telegraph, law enforcers across America had agreed that this comic had to be made to shut the fuck up. This is something that he was experiencing. He was watching this happen to Lenny, right? I was there when Lenny was busted in Chicago. In fact, I went to jail with him. Suddenly, a policeman stands up in the audience and says, just like they do on a street corner when someone gets shot or run down and crowd gathers, all right, show's over. He actually said it, not as a metaphor, but as a literal piece of information being transmitted to the audience by someone in authority. All right, the show's over. Wonderful. And they arrested Lenny Bruce, and then they asked George Carlin for his ID, and he said, I don't believe in identification. Sorry. And tried to give some kind of fucking stupid drunk speech. The cop grabbed me by the collar and pants in the old buckaroo fashion and hustled me down the stairs through the lobby and through the front door. I was passing the bar area and I yelled out, "Brenda, I'm going to jail." Then it's out the door with my hands cupped behind me and into the paddy wagon where Lenny was. I knew Lenny not just because he gave Jack and me our break, but because he was a friend of Brenda's. Whenever we were in the same city on the road, we'd check in with him and he'd always welcome us, especially Brenda, the shiksa. He was affectionate and lovable man, even to the cops. He always called them peace officers. He said, "Why you here, man?" I said I told him I didn't believe in this shit. I omitted to mention that it wasn't a principled First Amendment stand as much as it was a smart-ass joke. Lenny showed me how to work my arms down under my ass and my feet so the handcuffs were in front of me. Somehow that worked. Much better. And off I went to jail with Lenny Bruce in the paddy wagon. Even though it began as a drunk joke, the whole affair had a radicalizing effect on me. And skipping ahead a little bit, by now it was becoming pretty clear that Lenny wasn't being arrested for obscenity. He was being arrested for being funny about religion, and in particular, Catholicism. So George Carlin held a very high reverence for Lenny Bruce, and he talks a little bit about it here. 12 days before Lenny died in 1966, Brenda and I went up to his house in Hollywood. We'd just moved there, and we wanted to check in just like the old days. He had a beard by then, and he was completely immersed in his legal battle. He knew the law incredibly well on the specifics of his cases. He didn't appear in the clubs anymore. The Irish cops and judges had indeed shut him the fuck up. He was just about bankrupt, having spent all his income and intellect trying to vindicate himself. We visited him for a while, and he was affectionate and lovable as ever. That was the last time we saw him alive. And he talks a little bit more here. Lenny was one of the very few comics, perhaps the only one, I'd sought out and felt comfortable hanging with. I never had a circle of friends in the comedy biz. I never went to the delis or coffee shops after late shows where people would sit around eating breakfast and riffing till dawn. I always felt alien, not a part of them. Not that I was different or better, just a part. They had some common bond that didn't include or interest me. He really had a lot of respect for Lenny Bruce. Because Bruce, he didn't know it, but all of his struggle was leading to the comedy sort of awakening that we're all experiencing now, where, comedy is just in a super boom, and people need to laugh, and they love it. And, there's things that they did for us back then that we take for granted. And that's one of the reasons why I decided to shed some light on the early days of Carlin and what he was doing and where his inspirations came from. And he had struggles just like everybody else. He got a deal and an album and was on the radio, but he was still broke. So it kind of puts it in perspective of what he might have been a big comic back then, but wasn't exactly in the money yet. But he deeply cared for his friend, and he saw what Lenny Bruce was doing. He was happy to get arrested with him. For America, I might add. And it's strange, too. We've seen him in roles, but he had a lot of trouble acting in the beginning when he started to get some roles on television and things like that. It says, on top of failing, your brain is worrying. They hired me. They are thinking about that right now, about 3 more days that they have to go through. They must be very dissatisfied. I suck. I will continue to suck, and it will be on network television. But he wasn't a great actor in the beginning, and he really was hard on himself and couldn't really get through that. He thought he was going to be like Jack Lemmon II, but that obviously wasn't working out for him. It says here, objectively, 1967 was full of success. In February, my first album, Takeoffs and Put-Ons, came out and went gold. It was nominated for a Grammy, and I lost by a squeaker to Bill Cosby. I was playing the biggest nightclubs in the country, starting to play Vegas. That summer, I did another replacement series called Away We Go, 14 episodes, and this time Jackie Gleason's show slot. His career is still moving forward, but it says, the kind of stuff I did on Away We Go was singing in a trio with my 2 buddies of It Was a Very Good Year. It was creaky sketches with creaky premises. It was trivial numbers in bunny suits. It began boring in on me how untrue I was being to myself. So what he's talking about is he's getting a lot of these spots on TV, but he doesn't really like the material that he's doing because he kind of thought it was like cute. Here's a quote from the book here. But the real milestone from my Sullivan career was the show where I followed the skating chimpanzees. There was something I can say for the rest of my days. I once followed the skating chimpanzees. So, he's kind of emphasizing this cuteness that he's not really comfortable with that has made his career so far, right? But that's also something that I never knew about Carlin. He once followed skating chimpanzees on the Ed Sullivan Show. Imagine that. Another thing that probably comedians maybe don't deal with today as they used to was this aspect of gangsters. So maybe I'm incorrect. I of course have never played any big rooms or anything like that in Vegas. I don't have any idea. It's from the book here. When I first played Vegas at the Flamingo in 1966, opening for Jack Jones, my contract laid out very specifically the time I was to do, 19 minutes. I thought, fuck 19 minutes. This is my very first night ever in Vegas. This is an important moment. If I'm doing good, I'm going till I'm done. The audience is fantastic, and I ended up doing 22 minutes, 23 minutes over the contract. I came back to the dressing room, and there waiting for me is a male mountain with conspicuous bulge in his pocket. He very calmly and slowly tells me that my 3 extra minutes have cost the owner of the Flamingo, Mr. X, I blinked the name, some fucking staggering amount of money in the high 6 figures, which now would be 10 to 15 times that. They calibrated exactly how much the casino was earning every single minute of the day. The mountain man lets me know that in the future, I do not want Mr. X to be disappointed. And I have no illusion what that means. Part of this woolly mammoth's job description is rubbing out opening acts who do more than 19 minutes and dumping them in the desert. Despite growing up on some mean streets, it was the scariest fucking moment of my life. From then on, I never did a nanosecond over 19 minutes. I maybe have gone over a minute or two before, but I've never had anybody threaten my life over it because they're losing thousands of dollars per minute. I mean, what a different place, what a different attitude it was back then. And he just still had a problem. It says here, what was happening to me internally was that I'd got not just the seeds of doubt, but saplings of doubt sprouting inside me. About my acting, of course, but about all my goals. About being this rigid track, about being rewarded more and more for being cute and clever and funny, but not for being George Carlin. So, I mean, you can clearly see that he knows that he's doing the job that he's supposed to do, but he isn't satisfied. He's not satisfied with doing these cute bits, and he wants to be more of who he really is. And another way that we're hitting a milestone, and it's something that I never considered about George Carlin, was that he was working at a club in 1968, Bimbo's 365 Club in San Francisco, when Kennedy was shot. Made him not do the rest of his shows. Like, they wanted him to continue, and he said, fuck Bimbo. And he's not doing the show because Kennedy was assassinated. And that was a hard time for our nation. And he speaks a little bit more about it. I didn't respond with rage to any of what was happening in 1968. Dr. King's murder in April was depressingly predictable. There was a sinking feeling that something good was ebbing away and being encouraged in the direction by the usual forces. The establishment was winning. Its war, its assassins, its secret government, and that fact overpowered and debilitated me more than it enraged me. He's a very conscious person. And the assassinations of 2 icons of which he found extraordinary, which of course they were, John Kennedy and Martin Luther King, were 2 of the biggest figures of that time, and they worked very hard to help people, and they were both assassinated during his time as a comedian, when he's like growing still as a comic and figuring out what he wants to do and how he's going to move forward for the rest of his career, and he's struggling with money In a lot of cases, he's struggling with the material he's doing because he's cute and funny and not George Carlin. And he even kind of boasts about how he gets his FBI file started. I'll just read it. As I discovered 30 years later, thanks to the Freedom of Information Act, I got my FBI file started. Apparently, a week after the airing, the director himself received a copy of a letter which a Mr. Name Blacked Out, a former special agent, had sent to Jackie Gleason in Miami. Mr. Name Blacked Out had commented on the appearance of one George Carlin, an alleged comedian, and the subject of Carlin's material was the FBI and Mr. Hoover, and that his treatment of both was shoddy and in shockingly bad taste. The FBI doesn't like your comment about J. Edgar Hoover. You get a file. I wonder how many comedians have files today, right? Like, are they still keeping track of people who are saying a little too much? I don't know. But they did it back then in 1968. You know, this was kind of the start of a downfall in his career. It says here, terrible things were happening to me. But because of them, my life had begun to change. In the fall of 1969, I was fired from the Frontier Hotel in Vegas, where I had an extremely lucrative 2-year deal for saying the word ass. I had been working into my act, a little sort of thing. I got no ass, as you might notice. I go right from the shoulders to the heels. Like most Irish guys, no ass. When I was in the service, black guys used to see me in the showers and say, "Hey man, where your ass at? Stud got no ass." So he's canned for saying ass in Las Vegas. And then there's another thing that he points out. It says here, I ripped up Representative Bob Dornan, the red-headed maniac from Orange County, when he had just become a congressman. He talked about these hippies desecrating the flag and the violence of people who were blowing up math buildings, and protested about protesters getting violent. So I called him on it. Wait a minute. A flag is supposed to represent everything that a country does. It doesn't only represent the good things. If you burn the flag, you're burning the flag for what you perceive to be bad things the country has done. It's only a symbol. It's only a piece of cloth. And the violence of the left is symbolic. The injuries are not intended. The violence of the right is real, directed at people designed to cause injuries. Vietnam, nuclear weapons, police out of control are intentional forms of violence. The violence of the right is aimed directly at people, and the violence from the left is aimed at institutions and symbols. I got him mad as hell. It was nice turning around his own words, which was great. Take that, you cocksucker. So you gotta hand it to George. You know, this is something that comedians have always done, and this is why they wanted to shut Lenny Bruce up, is because they would be able to come on here and say things kind of like that. Where, you know, you don't have to agree with that statement, but he is making a pretty valid point that I believe exists even to this day. That's another side of Carlin that we really aren't exposed to, being so far removed from the time that he came up in, right? But pretty brave, too, speaking out at that time when, you know, they just assassinated a couple of people for doing virtually the same thing. Who's they? Well, we're not getting into that. I'm just using that to move forward. This next one, he got canceled for saying shit. I guess he kind of describes the bit in here, but it says, they closed me down 5 days early, paid me pro rata, and I was making $12,500 a week at the time, and canceled me forever. That was it for the foreseeable future for George Carlin in Las Vegas. He's getting canceled for shit and ass. Starts leading to what we all know as the 7 dirty words, right? Because he's getting canceled over this stuff. They're literally canceling him, and in some cases they're paying him and just saying, go away. Amongst all this, you know, he's getting canceled. He's not making a lot of money. They're struggling, and his wife Brenda gets pregnant again. The relevancy of Carlin really starts to come through, right? And I'll just quote from the book here. We had no money. This time I said, we can't do it. And very reluctantly, Brenda agreed. It was 1970, well before Roe v. Wade. We had about $700 in the bank. I took it out. I drove Brenda to Burbank, to the parking lot of a bank. A woman met her, blindfolded her, and drove her to an apartment house somewhere else in Burbank. She said there's just a room with a table and a bucket. They did the abortion. Then she was blindfolded again, driven back to the lot, and I took her home. I can't begin to imagine now what she went through because of that. Relevancy, 1970. This is what people do if it's not legal. This is what people do. They'll do whatever they plan to do, and it's done illegally. Like, what a traumatic experience that she went through because of the struggle that they were in, providing for Kelly, the three of them, trying to just make a career out of what he's doing, and he's not feeling great about it, but they're broke because he just keeps getting canceled for saying mundane things as we see it today. And look how relevant his life is to the current story that we have in America today. No one should have to go through that. It should at least be an environment where, it doesn't add to the traumatic event. It's traumatic enough. And that's why I mentioned at the beginning of the story that Carlin himself was almost aborted. These are, once again, it's just things that I found interesting within the book that sort of point to the larger societal problems that we face in America. This is the kind of thing that you get when you read a book like this, right? The behind the scenes, the stuff that isn't pretty. But then it comes to the things that we all know, right? Of course, the 7 words you can never say on television. Shit, piss, fuck, cunt, cocksucker, motherfucker, and tits. It's fun just saying that. I'm going to do that again. Shit, piss, fuck, cunt, cocksucker, motherfucker, and tits. How much fun is that? I'm sorry. I'm just basking in that. Like, now it's like, whatever. Comedians say that shit all the time, right? It's not even that big a deal, right? So in 1972, Carlin plays Carnegie Hall. Big validation for him at this point because he's moved away from doing that cutesy stuff that he wasn't super comfortable with. And he's really getting into what Carlin wants to say, and that changes his whole career and moves him forward, and he's playing Carnegie Hall now. He never talks in here about how he'd give up and get a regular straight job or something like that. No way. It gets even a little greasier, right? And I'm back to the book here. As usual, a price had to be paid for all this pleasure. I discovered in July of 72 that not only could you not say this heavy 7 on television, you couldn't say them in Milwaukee either. Here's how the AP reported it. Comedian George Carlin was taken into custody Friday and charged with disorderly conduct after he allegedly used profanity during his performance at Summerfest, a 10-day festival on the city's lakefront. Henry Jordan, executive director of Summerfest, said Carlin got up on stage and used a lot of profanity. The police went up on stage after he'd finished his act and arrested him. Jordan said he supported the police, adding that many of the crowd of 70,000 were children. So, he's up there doing his 7 dirty words, and they're basically saying, no, you cannot say that here. There's a lot of children in this 70,000 people. And there's even a point in here where here, I'll just read this. According to the arresting officer and complaint, Patrolman Elmer G. Lentz, about 40 of the many thousands of children were youths in wheelchairs who were physically unable to leave the showgrounds, even if they found the show was in bad taste. Okay. I don't know, that's some strange justification, right? Oh, they're in wheelchairs and can't leave. That doesn't even make sense. But so later on, when they're fighting this in court, they actually took it to court, and then he starts talking about how they, and from the book here, actually it wasn't a recording from the concert that was played in court for the judge, but the cut from Class Clown. During the recording, wrote the Milwaukee Journal, Judge Gehringer grinned and laughed softly, though self-consciously. Patrolman Lentz was incensed by the judge's ruling and said the hearing was a railroad job, although the only person who could have been railroaded was me, and I hadn't been. So I just think it's freaking amazing how in evidence they played a recording from Class Clown and the judge grinned and laughed a bit at it. That's a good sign, right? There he is making history in that way, right? About live performances and things like that. And then we'll cut forward a little bit here. On October 30th, 1973, there was a broadcast. And before they performed the show on the radio for WBAI, if you don't like this sort of thing, don't listen, is what they said. A New York man said a subsequent U.S. Supreme Court summary, who, while driving with his young son, heard the WBAI broadcast, wrote a letter to the FCC complaining about the use of such language on the air. After some back and forth between the FCC and WBAI, the FCC released in 1975 a declaratory order concerning the broadcast of indecent language, defining indecent as words that describe in terms patently offensive, as measured by contemporary community standards, sexual or excretory activities in organs at times of the day when there is a reasonable risk children may be in the audience. The FCC found my routine to be indecent by that standard and put what amounted to be a warning in WBAI's license file. WBAI, actually the Pacifica Foundation, which owns WBAI, fought it. Won in the U.S. Court of Appeals. The FCC appealed to the Supreme Court, and in 1978, the Supreme Court, surprise, surprise, found in favor of the FCC 5-4. The Los Angeles Times ran the news as its front page lead on July 3rd, 1978. Court banned 7 dirty words. They ruled that broadcasting is uniquely accessible to children, even those too young to read, which in turn means that the only thing you can safely broadcast anytime, anywhere, in any medium is material that's suitable for kids. Could this be why our society shows so many signs of arrested development? FCC vs. Pacifica Foundation has become the standard case to teach in communications classes and many law schools. I take perverse pride in that. I'm actually a footnote in the judicial history of America. The one part of this I really love is that all 9 members of the Berger Court had to sit around listening to the filthy words cut from Occupation Fool. I've often wondered if during the presentation of the evidence against me, any of them grinned and laughed softly, though self-consciously. Whatever your opinion might be of George Carlin, he is the reason that we can say what we want to say. He is the reason that this medium that we're on now, podcast, I can say the 7 dirty words that you're never supposed to say. It's fun because of the work that he had done for us. And as a comedian, I have a tremendous amount of respect for what he did for bringing that to the fore. And that I can sit here talking to you proudly, and I can say the 7 words you can never say on television. Shit, piss, fuck, cunt, cocksucker, motherfucker, and tits for George Carlin. And whatever connotation you tend to hold with any of those words, that's up to you. And no children in wheelchairs are being subjected to it unless they can actually dial it up, and that's on their parents' fault. So there we go. And, another fact about George Carlin is, October 1975, he hosted the first Saturday Night Live. And that's something that I had no idea about either, is that he was the first host, and he didn't like his acting. He made it work. And, there was a lot of talk in this book about drug addiction, with smoking a ton of pot and alcohol and cocaine, lots of cocaine, and it was a big problem for him and his wife that they had to get through. That their daughter was also struggling with them and their drug addictions and the amount of alcohol and pot and cocaine that was all over the place. That's something I didn't know, although you could have guessed. As I was reading through this for the quotes to explain kind of what what I wanted to about George Carlin, I came across this. I'd like to keep you up to date on the comedian's health sweepstakes. First, Richard Pryor had a heart attack. Then I had a heart attack. Then Richard burned himself up. Fuck that shit. I'm going to have another heart attack. Current standings are heart attacks, Carlin 2, Pryor 1, burning yourself up, Richie 1, Carlin 0. So him and Richard Pryor were kind of running in the same circle still, and you can tell that he gives some sort of reverence to him and jokingly talk about how they are having health problems. And the rest is kind of history because there's a lot in the book that I'm not going to cover because I wanted to focus more on the fact that without people like Lenny Bruce and Richard Pryor and George Carlin, that we wouldn't have the ability to go into clubs and say what we want to say, or the ability to say what we want to say on a podcast like this. So if you've made it this far, thank you for listening. And I really want to encourage you to go and find a copy of George Carlin's Last Words. In this book, I decided to read it because of a strange happening. Or I went to a thrift store and I saw this book on the shelf. George Carlin, Last Words, And I didn't purchase it. Sometime later, I went back and I purchased the book for a couple bucks. And I actually spent a lot of time reading this book and trying to understand where he came from. And it helps me know that, as a comedian, it's a long road, but if you don't give up, it can pay off. And the times are different now, but in good ways and in bad ways. And also, as a comedian, it puts into perspective that even a legend, an absolute legend, like George Carlin, he may have got deals early, but it wasn't easy for him. And he went through a lot of things that were hard on his family, and really still relevant today. His struggle with drug and alcohol, freedom of speech, abortions, all of this is still relevant. And regardless of what you think of his actual albums or if what he was doing towards the end of his days, of course, he passed away June 22nd, 2008. But that's why he's in the Hall of Fame, is because he really did something special for comedy. And it wasn't just him, but I think there would be a void without George Carlin, and he really is in the law books for the 7 dirty words. So I had a great time going over this, reading this book, and I highly, highly encourage all of you to pick up this book. And if you're a comedian, hey, you can find the audiobook read by his brother, Pat Carlin, and it's an abridged version, but still, if you got time to listen to that, go and listen to that. And if you can read the actual words in the book, I would encourage that too, because it changed my perspective on comedy. It changed my perspective on who I am as a comic and coming up in the world as a comic. Because even for Carlin, it wasn't easy, and he struggled with a lot of the things that we probably struggle with as well. Hey, all right, that's it. That's enough of this. But, hey, I'm James Manning III, and thanks for joining us on History in Whatevea. You can get a hold of me at jm3e.com. You can just go down to the bottom there and send me a message. And, I'd really, really appreciate it if any of you would get on the platforms that I broadcast this on, which is currently only Spotify and YouTube. I'm working on getting it on a few other platforms. But if you do, go on there, like and subscribe, follow, download, leave me a comment. Put a comment or rate my podcast. I really, really need your support. So if you're out there, please like, follow, share, do whatever you can for me if you like the material that I've been putting out. And if you have any questions for me, if you have a subject that you'd like me to do, I'm more than willing to hear that. Yeah, just go to jm3e.com and send me a message. The email is info@jm3e.com. So hey, thanks everybody for listening. And this has been another edition of History and Whatevea. I'm James Manning III. Hey, be kind to yourselves out there, and be kind to each other. This world is hard enough without others bringing us down. So, thank you so much for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon on another episode of History and Whatevea.